Motifs. So thank you for joining us. And I have the distinct pleasure of introducing you to 3 graduate students from the University of Alabama who make up our entire panel today. So thank you for attending. Before we get started and I introduce our first presenter, I just want to remind everybody that if you are listening and you have a question, we have our staff member Nolan who has the question card basket. So he'll circulate during the panel, and if you want to ask a question, please raise your hand and then he will supply me with those cards once our presentations are finished. All right. And now, of course, let me move on to introducing our first presenter. Before I do that, again, we want to thank our sponsors and all of our supporters for making this conference possible, and I hope you're enjoying this first day. All right. Our first presenter is named Phoenix Fogarty. Phoenix is currently a master's student in the English department at the University of Alabama. And through her coursework and research, Phoenix studies configurations of gender identity and sexuality in late American literature. And she is going to talk about a lost lady and injury and disability, correct? Yes. All right. Well, thank you very much. Phoenix, take it away.
Hello. Thank you for having me. So today my paper is titled Something Wild and Desperate, Cather, Animal Mutilation, and a Lost Lady. So here we go. So Cather's fascination with physiology and scientific experiments is well documented in biographical accounts and in several of her novels. In The World of Willa Cather, Mildred Bennett explains Cather's childhood fervor for, quote, slicing toads and amputating limbs. In nearly all of her novels, Cather depicts sickness and injury in gruesomely accurate detail. Yet in her essay, The Novel des Meubles, Cather rails against the cataloging of physical sensations and mechanical processes in literature, arguing that these methods reduce characters to, quote, mere animal pulp, and proposes instead that artists should leave the scene bare for the play of emotion. While Cather frequently leaves the physical sensations of her human characters unnamed, I argue that she also frequently transfers depictions of bodily trauma onto animals in order to generate emotional affect in or around her characters. Specifically, in A Lost Lady, Cather depicts Ivy's mutilation of the woodpecker as a foundational childhood trauma for Neil, and provides him with a model of masculinity to which he will define himself in opposition. Furthermore, through the emphasis on the woodpecker's femininity, coupled with Neil's desire to rescue the bird, Cather symbolizes and foreshadows Marion Forrester's life and relationship with Neil. By mapping the physical sensations of trauma and emotion onto animals, Cather simultaneously connects her characters inextricably to their natural setting, and allows her characters' emotional reactions to dwell in the murky realm of the thing not named. Though Cather's style and engagement with modernist literary forms sets A Lost Lady apart from her early pioneer novels, in her Return to the Prairie, Cather carries over her idealism about the preservation of wild indigenous plant and animal life. She describes the Forrester home as a type of Eden, the beacon of welcome set up on the hill, covered in vines and shrubbery and surrounded by, quote, broad meadows that were half pasture land, half marsh. Although the captain is lauded for his preservation of the marsh, the Forrester land by no means functions as a utopic space free from the intrusions of human development. In fact, part of the aesthetic appeal of the Forrester place is the, quote, private lane bordered by Lombardy poplars. This rigid restructuring of the land creates the illusion of unkempt natural wildness, while maintaining the captain's high aesthetic standards. Despite its artifice, the Forrester land remains a natural and peaceful space, as Marion has forbidden the use of guns, for Neil and his friends to go fishing and, quote, behave like wild beasts, chasing a striped water snake, as birds and butterflies darted everywhere. Through her depiction of the Forester place, Cather endorses the captain's complicated relationship with nature, which reflects the attitudes of pioneer settlers who appreciated the wild beauty of natural flora and fauna, yet carved out space for themselves to prosper. Consequently, Ivy Peters' presence on the Forester land represents a modern and violent intrusion into this historical paradise. Cather describes Ivy in industrial, mechanized terms. He had, quote, an unnatural erectness, as if he had a steel rod down his back, and carried a gun and game bag, despite Marion's rules. Physically, Cather depicts Ivy as, quote, an ugly fellow with eyes of a snake's or a lizard's, deepening his association with the evil Eden serpent. Most damning, though, is his reputation as Poison Ivy, a nickname earned because it was well known that he had made away with several other dogs before he had poisoned the judge's friendly water spaniel. By contrasting Ivy's senseless violence against animals with the Forester's preservation of animal life, Cather casts this new generation of men as needlessly destructive and self-interested, before Ivy has ever interfered with human affairs. Through Ivy's mutilation of the woodpecker on the Forester land, Cather depicts Neil's psychic wounding, which permanently stifles his developing masculinity. After hitting the woodpecker with eerie precision with his slingshot, Ivy pulls out a box that, quote, contained curious little instruments, tiny sharp knife blades, hooks, curved needles, a saw, a blowpipe, and scissors. It is here where Cather begins the, quote, cataloging of a great number of material objects and explaining mechanical processes that she condemns in the novel Des Meublés. Cather draws upon her knowledge of medical tools and processes to emphasize the methodical nature of Ivy's sadism against this helpless bird. Though he doesn't know enough about the bird to correctly identify its gender, he knows just how to torture the bird without killing her. Quote, he held the woodpecker's head in a vise made of his thumb and forefinger, enclosing its panting body with his palm. Quick as a flash, as if it were a practice trick, with one of those tiny blades, he slit both the eyes that glared in the bird's stupid little head and instantly released it. The woodpecker rose in the air with a whirling corkscrew motion, darted to the right, struck a tree trunk, to the left, and struck another. Throughout this lengthy and gruesome passage, Cather again emphasizes the habitual nature of Ivy's animal mutilation by describing this act as a practice trick. She characterizes the behaviors and physical processes of the bird in such grotesque detail that the reader experiences this trauma alongside Neil and the onlookers, who, quote, wouldn't have believed that they could be so upset by a hurt woodpecker. Rather than describe the behaviors or emotions of the boys in explicit language, Cather continues to humanize the woodpecker, noting there was something wild and desperate about the way the darkened creature beat its wings in the branches, whirling in the sunlight and never seeing it. We know how Neil feels here, not through emotive language, but through the sympathy evoked by the bird and the actions Neil takes to rescue it, resulting in the physical trauma of a broken arm. At this moment, Neil's childish innocence, characterized by his prior frolicking in the swamp with animals and friends, is harshly disrupted. The Forester place is no longer a safe haven for children and animals, but has now become the site where masculinity is defined. Ivy Peters defines his masculinity through brute strength, violence, and the destruction of animal life. For Neil, Ivy's example has hardened him against the morals of the new generation, causing him to cling to a fading model of masculinity, represented by Captain Forester, founded in admiration of nature and in rescuing those who need saving. Through Neil's rescue attempt of the woodpecker and his emphasis on the bird's gender, Cather foreshadows Marion's spiral of confusion and her relationship with Neil. In Bird Symbolism in the Awakening and A Lost Lady, Elizabeth Ells identifies the parallels between the struggling bird and Marion, arguing that, quote, just as the mutilated female woodpecker flounders while trying to make progress, Marion whirls as she attempts to reestablish herself after her husband experiences a financial crisis and dies. However, while Marion's confusion in her life begins with the downfall of her husband, Neil sees her struggles as the consequence of her business relationship with Ivy. Just like the woodpecker who suffered mutilation at Ivy's hands in the Forester's absence, without the protection of her husband, Marion falls vulnerable to Ivy's financial risks and schemes. Neil claims that Ivy will take advantage of anybody's necessity, and that by draining the marsh, he had asserted the power over the people who had loved those unproductive meadows for their idleness and silvery beauty. Even though Marion claims that Ivy's investments are helping her finances, Cather casts Ivy as an economic predator, with little regard for the well-being of his clients, and Marion is never able to overcome her financial losses with Ivy's help, leaving her to struggle with housework and business in the absence of hired help. Charmian Gutsky notes the many ways that Ivy takes advantage of Marion in the trafficking of Mrs. Forrester, and even takes it as far as to liken the situation to prostitution because of the ways he uses and fertilizes her land, coupled with the, quote, unconcerned groping of Mrs. Forrester's breast while she was making a pastry. As a result of Ivy's preying, Neil sees Marion, quite literally, like a bird caught in a net. If only he could rescue her and carry her off like this, off the earth of sad, inevitable periods, away from age, weariness, adverse fortune. However, in trying to save Marion from these inevitabilities, he idolizes her beyond reason and only ends up hurting himself, just as he did when he broke his arm rescuing the bird. Neil's desire to rescue Marion not only parallels his attempt to save the woodpecker, but also reflects his desire to imitate the chivalry of Captain Forrester, who won Marion's heart by carrying her through a dangerous canyon after she broke both her legs in a fall from a cliff. Though Neil correctly identifies Marion's desire to be rescued, his folly lies in his tendency to blame Marion for seeking help from established, capable men like the captain, instead of allowing herself to remain as the injured bird in the tree waiting for Neil to rescue her. As in A Lost Lady, Cather uses the trauma of animals to reflect the trauma of Claude in One of Ours, published only a year later. According to Stephen Trout, Claude Wheeler stands in dramatic opposition to the 20th century mechanization of American agriculture, and the pragmatic, neo-utilitarian values used by farmers to justify the destruction of indigenous plant and animal life. As a result, Claude sees any mistreatment of animals to be an egregious offense. In the opening chapter, Claude establishes his disdain for a farmhand named Jerry when he learns of Jerry's neglect of an old mare named Molly after she stepped on a nail. Cather writes, quote, "He pulled the nail out of her foot and said nothing to anybody and drove her to the cultivator all day. Now she had been standing in her stall for weeks, patiently suffering, her body wretchedly thin and her legs swollen until it looked like an elephant's." This mistreatment of Molly instills in Claude a permanent vendetta against Jerry, much like Neil and Ivy, and deepens his hatred for farm productivity that comes at the expense of nature. In a similar example, Claude thinks back to a memory from childhood when his father chopped down his favorite, quote, beautiful round-topped cherry tree and left it lying on the ground beside its bleeding stump. Though this example features the destruction of plant life instead of animal life, Cather personifies the tree and even parallels Molly's injured hoof through her use of the phrase bleeding stump. Again, this moment traumatizes Claude and turns him against his father for his violent mistreatment of the land, which troubles his developing masculinity. Later in life, Claude is deeply wounded by the death of several of his pigs during a winter storm. Quote, "They found the pigs all lying in a heap at one end and pulled the top ones off alive and squealing. 12 hogs at the bottom of the pile had been suffocated. They lay there wet and black in the snow, their bodies warm and smoking, but they were dead. There was no mistaking that." The other members of the Wheeler household cannot understand Claude's sentimentality about the pigs, and Mahaley suggests to get right at them hogs and butcher them today, to preserve his profit. Hardened against the valuation of profit over animal life from his previous experiences, Claude rejects Mahaley's suggestion in a fit of rage, which only worsens his financial struggles during this cruel winter. In each of these examples, Cather uses animal or plant mutilation to represent Claude's attitudes about his family, job, and purpose in life. Furthermore, Cather's lengthy and gruesome depictions of animal mutilation contrast greatly with the, quote, 3 clean bullet holes that kill Claude, proving Cather's resistance to detailing the physical sensations of her human characters. Interestingly, we can also see the ways that Cather maps human sensations onto animals in her work as early as O Pioneers. Cather introduces Emile as a child who is frightened and whimpering because his kitten has been chased up a telegraph pole. Cather writes, "At the top of the pole crouched a shivering gray kitten, mewing faintly and clinging desperately to the wood with her claws. The little creature had never been so high before, and she was too frightened to move." In this passage, Cather establishes Emile's innocence and connection to nature through his concern for the kitten. Further, Emil's tearful and frightened emotions are mirrored in the physical sensations of the kitten. Just as the busy townsfolk hurry past the kitten without noticing it, they also fail to notice Emil's struggle. In another example, Alexandra fondly remembers the time when she and Emil saw in the bay, quote, a single wild duck swimming and diving and preening her feathers, disporting herself very happily in the flickering light and shade. They sat for a long time, watching the solitary bird take its pleasure. Both Alexandra and Emil recall this event regularly throughout Emil's childhood, romanticizing the duck as, quote, a kind of enchanted bird that did not know age or change. After Emil's death, Alexandra remembers the duck as representing Emil's former innocence. Cather appropriately references ducks again to depict Emil's loss of innocence and foreshadow Emil and Marie's impending death. Now a young man, Emil takes Marie down to the pond where he shoots and kills 5 ducks, a stark contrast to his earlier admiration of the enchanted duck. Emil delights in the gore, unlike Marie, who, quote, took up one of the birds, a rumpled ball of feathers with the blood dripping slowly from its mouth, and looked at the live color that still burned on its plumage. As she let it fall, she cried in distress, "Oh, Emil, why did you?" In this passage, the couple's romantic chemistry is established, but disrupted just as quickly by the violence of gunfire. Covered in blood, Marie blames Emil for the violence, despite her request to accompany him to the pond in the first place. The scene looks ahead to the ways Marie blames Emil for desiring her, despite her own flirtations with him, and parallels the eventual double murder of the couple in the orchard at the hands of the jealous Frank. Just as Cather minimizes the violent death of Claude, she avoids depicting the action of the murder here, and instead depicts only the before and after of the gruesome event. As I have shown, animal mutilation permeates Cather's novels. Though Cather does not shy away from depicting the gruesome reality of injury and illness in her human characters, she places a dramatic emphasis on the suffering, trauma, and dismemberment of animals. In most instances, Cather employs these depictions of animal suffering in the first act of her novels, if not on the very first page, when her characters are still undeveloped. By doing so, she allows readers to draw conclusions about the affect and morality of her characters based solely on their reactions to animal mutilation, which connects them intrinsically to their natural landscapes. Thank you.
Thank you, Phoenix. Sorry, I didn't have all of my things ready to go. My apologies. Our next presenter is Keegan Hensley. Keegan recently finished his MA in Literature at the University of Alabama, where he studied Cather and the 20th Century American Novel. He currently teaches English at the Darlington School in Rome, Virginia, and Keegan's paper is titled Breaking Steel in a Lost Lady, Injury, Breakage, and Disability. So welcome, Keegan.
Good morning, everyone. Can y'all hear me okay? Reasonable? Okay, thank you. No? No? Closer? Better? Better? Okay, thank you. I've been pleased to see so far the recognition that A Lost Lady is in fact quite an edgy book when we really think about it. I was struck particularly with The Lost Lady, how subtle the drama is, but also how it's punctuated by moments of intense violence. And I think this is characteristic of Cather's work in general. So Phoenix focused on the sort of bodily mutilation of animals. I'm going to focus on human injury in this book. None of you are strangers to the violence that Cather's characters suffer. Her Great Plains trilogy returns to gun violence again and again as a theme of the American frontier. In My Antonia, the most famous of these novels, dwells specifically on the aftermath of Mr. Shimerda's tragic death. Some of Cather's young men die brutally at war, whether it's as closely described as Claude Wheeler's is in one of ours, or whether it's as distantly hinted at as Tom Outland's is in For the Professor's House. Sometimes, though, Cather brushes over these violent episodes with a kind of practical and morbid humor. You can think of specifically when the drunken wanderer leaps into the threshing machine in My Antonia and Antonia seems really more concerned that the machine ain't never worked right since. A Lost Lady kind of stands apart from these Plains novels because of its focus on the slower decline of a once great railroad aristocrat, right? We witness this decline over Neil's narrative shoulder, the young idealist who identifies with the pioneer generation that precedes him. He projects these ideas onto the Foresters, themselves railroad aristocrats of a small Nebraska town, but he grows increasingly disillusioned with them after Mrs. Forrester begins a series of sexual affairs with younger men, and Daniel suffers a debilitating fall in the mountains. As I'll argue, these issues of impairment and injury are inextricable from those of social standing in A Lost Lady. These two are intimately connected in the text. And this is also why Cather returns to the railroad as a way to write a tense sexual narrative. I propose foremostly a way of reading Cather's work for injury and violence, that these aren't just moments that pop up in the text that we're supposed to wince at and then return to the narrative from, that these are actually really important part of the text and we ought to be paying attention to them. And that by doing so, we can understand Cather's thinking about things like settler colonialism, desire in narrative, and it also, as I'll argue, serves as a way to construct villains in an interesting way. Cather tends to focus on the men who build these railroad aristocracies in order to measure masculine economic power. In My Antonia, Lena Lingard uses the railroad to disparage one of Antonia's suitors. Quote, Tony talks about Larry Donovan like he was president of the railroad. Lena uses the railroad president as a point of comparison for masculinity that creates a disparity between the idealized railroad president, right, and Larry Donovan, who works as, quote, a passenger conductor, one of those train crew aristocrats, in dubious quotes. Cather thus uses different kinds of labor on the railroad to establish social standing for men. The Midwestern railroad patriarch is a kind of stereotype or a character that returns again and again in Cather's fiction, perhaps due to the real image created in 19th century print culture. He seems as immutable as any cultural icon does for Cather. In this way, A Lost Lady seems very much like the westerns of its time, which functioned to ritualistically affirm the hero's integrity and innocence despite sort of subtly stated acts of violence against what hegemonic discourse represents as sort of outlaws or savages, this kind of trope. Mr. Forrester is such a railroad man, though, at the end of the day, and Cather uses like the hero myth that we associate with him to write a novel of 19th century labor. The narrator tells us that, quote, there were then two distinct social strata in the prairie states, the homesteaders and the handworkers who were there to make a living, and the bankers and gentlemen ranchers who came from the Atlantic seaboard to invest money in dubious quotes again, develop our great West, as they used to tell us. You can sense the cynicism even in the opening pages. Here the economy creates a stark class divide between the poor laborers and the rich managers. This is what the text tells us on the American frontier. The beginning of the novella questions even the rhetoric of such an economy as early as page 3, as suggested by the past tense used to and the dubious quotation marks around develop our great West, right? A Lost Lady begins at the historical decline of this economy in rhetoric. Neil's narrative perspective also creates an essential contradiction between the slowing power of the railroad tycoon economically and the enduring language of manifest destiny as a kind of rhetoric that outlasts the actual culture. Captain Forrester seems to represent the stable, constant values of the pioneers, yet he becomes helpless before temporal and economic change. We can measure these values in the phrases that Mr. Forrester himself uses to describe his move to Sweetwater. When he describes his life philosophy during that opening dinner scene, he says, what you think of and plan day by day, in spite of yourself, so to speak, you will get. That is, unless you're one of the people who get nothing. Mr. Forrester offers vague and kind of contradictory advice for getting ahead in the working world. He concedes that there are, in fact, immovable barriers that separate, right, those two classes of people that the book asserts at the outset. Despite Neil's own glorious imagination of the Forrester, and part of our job is to parse through that imagination, the text seems skeptical about this latter class of manager that Daniel Forrester belongs to. These complications only further invite us to question the labor relations between the book's characters, too. Oftentimes, Cather shrouds her most vivid cultural flashpoints in narrative ambiguity. Susan Rosowski emphasizes the narratological changes that Cather made from the serial to the book edition of A Lost Lady, which was to be about the impression that Mrs. Forrester made upon Neil and others. As much as Neil functions as a narrative keyhole, though, even the parts of the Forresters' lives that we see are filtered through his consciousness. Neil intrudes upon the narrative to make it difficult for us to question Captain Forrester, and Cather makes Neil's imagination of him most obvious when this filter is at its most dense. These moments usually fail to find a material source for a person's immaterial qualities, as is the case when Neil hears Mr. Forster describe his life philosophy. Quote, "Something in the way he uttered his unornamented phrases gave them the impressiveness of inscriptions cut in stone." Neil struggles to pin down exactly what makes the captain seem so impressive in his speech, resorting to non-descriptors, like something and unornamented, to justify his respect. These moments of grand impression and seeming beauty invite us to question the ethics of these pioneers. Whenever he presents his philosophy, we're challenged to see through romantic descriptions by the narrator in order to discover something about labor relations. You will get, unless you're one of the people who get nothing. These two groups, those who get and those who don't, come into contact when Mr. Forster's bank fails. It's at this point that A Lost Lady sort of leans toward the side of Captain Forster, even as it shows the contradictions of that image. It's a complicated relationship between. Mr. Forster wins our good graces in this episode, and this kind of makes it difficult for us to see the economic system that underpins our respect for him, too. When Mr. Forster assumes financial responsibility for the loss of his workers, this is especially the case. Quote, "Poles and Swedes and Mexicans looking scared to death. A lot of them couldn't speak English. Seems like the only English word they knew was Forster." Neil and the lawyer Judge Pomeroy only respect him more for defending these lower-class laborers, and in defending them, he cements his status as a romantic figure, and I think ultimately emerges as a sympathetic character to us as readers. As Amara Keeley points out, though, the status depends on a class of supplicants who are unable to participate in the economic system they've been colonized into. According to Keeley's reading, Cather writes the bank episode in order to excuse him from suspect management strategies and business practices, which seems particularly appropriate for a book that itself asserts the class divide between the homesteaders and hand workers and the bankers and gentlemen ranchers. Neil struggles to see that these are in fact two different classes of people, and it's through this contradiction that the captain emerges as a kind of fantasy in the text, and it's that fantasy that I'll be describing to you in terms of the railroad and in terms of injury, right? This is how Cather characterizes this contradiction. Firstly, he's associated with the material of iron in order to conflate the railroad man with railroad values. She builds her portrait of the captain by closely associating him with the physical materials of the rail. As the captain's health fails, he starts to sleep in a narrow iron bed, whose crossbars even resemble the lines he used to lay. After the bank fails and he suffers a debilitating stroke, a doctor tells Neil that the captain, quote, "was originally a man of iron." The upper-class members of Sweetwater see him as a man respectably connected to the railroad and as someone with the will to power necessary to put, quote, "the plains and mountains under the iron harness," right? There's a double meaning here. His status is dependent on the railroad, and so Cather characterizes him as such using those materials. Some critics have taken notice of the descriptive quirks that surround him in the text. Van Wynen argues that that the captain has become, quote, "so huge and flabby that he seems to be melting under the sun's heat." In some ways, this image of grotesqueness reminds us of Sapphira, right? Some of the other characters in Cather's work who undergo slow declines over the course of their novels. Patricia Young sees this metaphorical connection with iron, or uses this metaphorical connection to explain how human symbols like the captain affect the residents of Sweetwater. Once those symbols collapse, once the captain falls from his horse and suffers a stroke, the spirit of the men who hold these symbols dear also collapses. According to Young, his literal and metaphorical fall serves as an allegory for the decline of pioneer values more generally. He becomes a symbol of the immaterial virtues that Neil holds so dearly, with all their attendant fantasies. Sweetwater's imagination of him also depends on his physical stature as a man of iron, someone whose actual physical power and strength allows him to lay down the rails. Cather associates him with the strength of iron, but the second thing that he's associated with is the strength of the mountain, his ability to tame the wild landscape under the iron harness. The captain retires from his managerial position, quote, "after his terrible fall with his horse in the mountains, which broke him so that he could no longer build railroads." This line ends the first chapter with an image that appears, it's romantic to us, the explorer charting new territory, looking for places to lay down the rails over. Interestingly, though, the landscape that the captain has supposedly tamed strikes back at him in this text. Mrs. Forster herself compares another of her husband's falls to the supposedly immovable mountain. Quote, "It was simply because he was unsteady. He had trouble getting up. I still shiver to think of it. To me, it was as if one of the mountains had fallen down." This comparison reveals something interesting about Cather writes these kinds of characters. The railroad becomes synonymous with Mr. Forrester in the same way as his employees do, in the same way as the mountains do in this reading. Cather's trains travel between, as Facknitz argues, the edge between naturalist and environmental machinery and the romantic idealist's impulse to essentialize, our second nature. According to Facknitz's reading, the symbols of the railroad allow Cather to avoid committing to either of those traditions. As I show, though, both of these are used in tandem to characterize the captain, right, in order to show the essentializing qualities that he has in this culture. The railroad doesn't straddle such a line, but it serves as a convenient metaphor for associating the corrupt captain, if we're being unforgiving, to the landscape of the American West. His traumatic injury thus invites us to decouple these two things, the naturalist environmentalism with the romantic's impulse to essentialize. Other moments of injury in the text do similar work, propelling the plot and signaling theme. Reading for injury here also reveals how Cather constructs gender according to this pioneer myth as well. The Forresters fall in love after Mrs. Forrester breaks her legs in the mountains, I think, as Phoenix mentioned. Mrs. Forrester tells the story late in the novella to a group of young men she's taken under her wing after the death of the captain. Cather chooses to describe this scene in some detail, right, which is more than we get in other moments in her work. With her broken legs dangling, she suffered terribly, fainted again and again, but she noticed that she suffered less when the captain carried her. The young men learned to respect the late captain as a man capable of saving others from the untamed wilderness as well, not just able to go out and do the thing, to lay down the iron rails over it, but as someone who's capable of bringing others back from it too. Stephanie Bauer argues that this scene functions as a metaphoric representation of sex, and that pain and danger are eroticized together in this moment. Bauer connects the two in order to show how masculinity and femininity are constructed together. Argue that this sexually charged scene is also charged with the same logic and strength that the economic fantasy that I talked about previously relies upon. Cather draws attention to the security that this strength gives her. I could feel his heart pump and his muscles strain. And when he balanced himself and me on the rocks, I knew that if we fell, we'd go together, and he would never drop me. In many ways, this is just another story that the Forresters tell, at dinner to impress the young men. Mrs. Forrester thus occupies a similar space as Achilles' supplicants in this reading too, right? In the same as the mountains, in the same as the laborers. Scenes that conflate pain and pleasure via injury and healing also grant us access to Cather's theme of aesthetic possibility in A Lost Lady. Early in the novella, Neil falls from a tree while trying to kill a bird out of mercy, which of course foreshadows the fall of Mrs. Forrester later in the novella. Ivy Peters, one of Guska's commodifiers, lifts Neil's limp body and starts up the hill toward the Forrester home because he was much bigger and stronger than everyone else, Ivy was. This episode echoes how the captain carries Mrs. Forrester down. Much like in that scene, injury and recovery are charged with the erotic, Neil sort of having his first experience while he recovers in the Forrester home. What soft fingers she had, what a lovely lady she was, right? There's an ellipsis here that interrupts an external point about the stark divide between him and the Forresters and transitions into Neil's actual thoughts. Quote, "At his house, everything was horrid when one was sick. ... What soft fingers Mrs. Forrester had, and what a lovely lady she was." This combination of pain and eroticism sort of breaks the narration itself at this moment, and it's at this break that we can enter into think about class relations in the Forrester home. Neil imagines Mrs. Forrester as an abstract member of the railroad aristocracy, looking at the soft fingers and the lace ruffle of her dress. Rosowski and Bauer have shown how Neil, Ivy, and the captain all use her to measure aesthetic value, and that A Lost Lady serves to disrupt this notion that one can be imagined into perfection. This is certainly the case for Neil, who creates a downward spiral for her through her sexual affairs with younger men. Bauer connects these affairs to Neil's own project of recreating the railroad aristocracy a bit belatedly. Neil's injury thus creates the circumstances for such an aristocracy to arise in his mind, and thus in the narration of the text. He juxtaposes Ivy Peters against his imagination of the captain, but the two are much more alike than they seem to us. Cather characterizes the villains of A Lost Lady in relationship to the captain in order to ignore the fact that these class relationships haven't changed all that much. Much like how the Forresters belong to different generations, Neil and Ivy sort of aspire to different generational values here. Here, Ivy embodies the strength of the captain that implies the ability to shape the land. The narrator looks down on this trait, characterizing Ivy as an unnatural intruder in the Edenic Forester estate. Just as the original Eden contained a serpent, according to Els, so does the Forester's place in the form of Ivy Peters, who's slightly older and doesn't respect either the land or the Foresters. The metaphor seems apt, given how the text characterizes Ivy. This line of sight, though, ignores how Ivy works in the text as a kind of scapegoat for wider generational changes, right? We boiled everything down into Ivy. He carries the wounded Neil into the Forester home in order to, quote, see what it was like, and this he had always wanted to do. For Ivy, Neil's injury is an opportunity to gain access to a place that his class status bars him from. Once Ivy becomes a lawyer, Neil fails to see that Ivy's legal work of redistributing the Forester property only differs from its patriarch's work or its owner's work in the matter of its danger. Achille notes that Ivy Peters is not always a villain. He's done positive things that are barely acknowledged or rarely acknowledged in the text. If the captain is a man of iron, Ivy Peters carries himself, and I'll quote it again, with unnatural erectness, as if he had a steel rod down his back. It seems fitting for the narrative that Ivy's characterized with the same strength and rigidity as the captain, but with the updated material of steel. Villains in A Lost Lady are all able to literally break Mr. Forester and Neil's imagination. Frank Ellinger, one of Mrs. Forrester's lovers, gives, quote, the look of a man who could bite an iron rod in two at the snap of his jaws. Even as it pretends to show a generational change, A Lost Lady shows how really we're updating only in the strength of our materials. The captain comes under the same iron harness that he places the mountains of the American West under. We can read for these moments in the most violent parts of the novella, where the body and its associations tear apart to reveal contradictions in the narrative. A Lost Lady conflates the body with sort of these technologies more than any of our other texts. This is particularly the case for Captain Forester, whom I focused on, the man of iron defeated by the mountains he's colonized. The captain and his wife create these sort of fantasies, and really Neil does for us, including the telling bank scene that characterizes poor laborers in the same way as it characterizes the mountains he laid iron harnesses upon. Cather uses the association of the body with the machine in this way, the connection between iron and the work one does, steel and the work one does, to expose the inner workings of the way we talk about the railroad and the way we talk about colonial discourses. Through this reading, the captain and Ivy emerge not just as foils, but in some ways doing a lot of the similar work. Thank you.
Thank you, Keegan. Next, we have Sarah Wade, who is going to read her paper, Care Communities in a Lost Lady. Sarah is a graduate student at the University of Alabama, and she currently is enrolled in a course on Willa Cather's fiction. She mostly studies Victorian women novelists and has also presented a paper on feminist ethics in Middlemarch at the ACETA conference. So welcome, Sarah. Also, it's time to start writing your questions on your question cards.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Great. So as was mentioned, my paper is titled Care Communities in a Lost Lady. And where others have, sorry, down a little. There we go. Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, so where others have talked about kind of injury in the body, I'm going to look more at what happens after injury and the caretaking and relationships that are formed kind of in those situations. Okay, so scholars of the feminist ethic of care, such as Virginia Held, whose ideas I use a lot in this paper, have pointed to caretaking as a vital aspect of any community and one that creates and strengthens bonds between people. These scholars often argue that, quote, care communities, or networks of dependent relationships formed through acts of care, go unrecognized in most theories of moral philosophy, largely because caretaking is undervalued as a form of work that typically falls to women in most societies. Relationships in communities built through acts of care, particularly of injured or ill characters, pervade the text of Willa Cather's A Lost Lady. Whether Marion caring for Neil's broken arm, Daniel Forester carrying Marion back to camp after her fall from the mountain, or the larger community caring for Daniel after his strokes, caretaking appears throughout the text and changes the nature of the relationships between characters. While scholarship around the ethic of care has frequently portrayed care as the cement that connects relationships and communities, it can just as easily expose the cracks in the foundations, and both occur in A Lost Lady. Analyzing care in Willa Cather's A Lost Lady helps us to better understand not only how care forges and fractures bonds between characters within the novel, but also the dangers inherent in care itself, particularly when it's co-opted by agents of patriarchal surveillance and control. In her article, A Chorus of Gossips, Mistaking Invasion for Intimacy in Willa Cather's A Lost Lady, Evelyn Funda gives us a helpful tool to analyze this problem with care in the novel. She makes the useful distinction between invasion on one hand and intimacy on the other, and notes the confusion that some characters in the novel experience between the two. This dichotomy is extremely applicable to an analysis of care in the novel, as it is important to distinguish between occasions when care brings about intimacy and when it allows for boundary crossing and invasion. In A Lost Lady, when care is driven by love and affection for the other person, and a real knowledge of and desire to meet the care recipient's actual needs, then care seems to build community. However, when care comes from a desire to invade someone's life in order to judge and control their actions from a closer viewpoint, then care seems to corrode relationships and reveal the community's warped values. Not all care communities in the novel fit within this binary of genuine versus manipulative care, which brings about either intimacy or invasion, but they can be productively analyzed along the continuum formed between these two extremes. The first major instance of caretaking in the novel occurs when Neil breaks his arm. Here, Mrs. Forrester takes charge to bring Neil into her home to care for him, and Neil builds her up as a kind of domestic goddess and ideal woman. The narrator states that Neil, quote, was in pain, but he felt weak and contented, end quote. The care of another here and elsewhere seems to alleviate pain or at least make it bearable. Notably, this is Neil's first real memory of Marion Forrester and the Forrester household, or at least the first one related to the reader. It holds great significance for him due to the care itself, as well as the proximity to Marion that it allows him. This care becomes the first moment in which he interacts with Marion up close, which begins the path that brings them into and out of each other's lives for many years. Here, Funda's dichotomy of intimacy versus invasion is very apparent and very useful. This instance of caretaking undoubtedly does bring about some form of intimacy, as Neil is welcomed into Marion's bedroom and she personally nurses him. However, it also seems to bring about a situation or start Neil down a road toward him feeling kind of comfortable invading Marion's life in other ways and judging her decisions, casting judgment on her because he assumes a kind of intimacy between them that's really the result of invasion on his part. Neil's perspective on the care that Marion gives him in this scene is also always shaped by forces outside of her and more integral to who he is. His past experience with women, particularly female caregivers and housekeepers, his attraction to Marion, and his idealization of her. He notices her, quote, soft fingers, lace ruffle, and white throat rising and falling, and he compares her gentle care with the, quote, horridness of his own home when one was sick. Her care seems, quote, sweetened by how Neil perceives her and feels about her, as well as by the flattering comparison with the care received in his own home, without a maternal presence. In this way, Neil's interactions with Marion, in this moment and others, deal more with his own perceptions and the image he has of her in his mind, rather than anything truly specific to her. This precludes any possibility for real understanding and community between them, despite the reciprocal care they each give each other at various points in the novel. As many scholars of the ethic of care point out, he doesn't see her needs as much as projecting them onto her. So another important care-based relationship in the text is that between Marion and Daniel Forrester. This relationship begins and ends with care and has instances of both failed care and care that seems fueled by a genuine understanding of and love for each other. In the moment he meets Marion, Daniel assumes the role of caretaker. In a passage that is omitted from the story that Marion tells the young men at her dinner party, but which Neil gives to the reader anyway. It's noted that Marion, quote, was sent up into the mountains after the man to whom she was previously engaged was shot and killed by the husband of another woman. When Marion tells the story, however, she begins with her fall from a mountain in which she broke both of her legs. Thus, at the beginning of her love story, whoever the narrator is, Marion is in need of both social and physical care. After the actual fall, the narrator notes that although multiple men, quote, took turns carrying Marion, she suffered less when Captain Forrester carried her. Just as Neil still feels pain but also has some comfort when Marion cares for his broken arm, Marion also suffered terribly, but suffered less when in the care of Captain Forrester in particular. As Virginia Held explains in her book on care, the care itself is made more valuable because it comes from a, quote, particular other with whom the care receiver has a relationship. Marion also notes that she, quote, had noticed Daniel Forrester very little prior to this act of care, but afterward she quickly becomes close with him and ends up agreeing to marry him. The bond created in the initial caring makes Marion want further care from him. Quote, "It was Captain Forrester I wanted to hold my hand when the surgeon had to do things to me. He stayed at the camp until I could begin to walk, holding to his arm. When he asked me to marry him, he didn't have to ask twice. Do you wonder?" End quote. Captain Forrester here becomes Marion's regular caretaker, which earns him first her attention and then her love. Through Daniel's care for Marion, she becomes bonded to him and goes from not even noticing him to accepting his marriage proposal. Her question at the end of the passage, "Do you wonder?" points to the seemingly self-evident effect that positive caretaking, motivated by concern and affection, has on someone's feelings for another. Daniel's care for Marion continues in other parts of their marriage, such as in his tacit agreement to Marion's extramarital affairs, which shows his understanding of Marion's needs and his willingness to acquiesce to them, even if they might require some sacrifice on his part. This care relationship is reversed later on in the text, when Daniel Forrester suffers multiple debilitating strokes and comes to rely on the care of his wife and others for support. However, at this point, Daniel has already failed in his care for his wife in other ways. Immediately prior, he does not look out for his wife's financial interests when he decides to pay back the depositors rather than holding on to any savings for Mrs. Forrester's future use. When discussing Daniel Forrester's moral rectitude and not allowing any of these working class men to, quote, lose a dollar, Judge Pomeroy claims that Captain Forrester, quote, acted just as I hope I would have done in his place, but I am an unmarried man, end quote. In the same breath in which he praises the captain's upstanding decision, the judge acknowledges the bonds of care that tie the captain to his wife, and which casts some doubt on this action's morality. This decision not to care for his wife's future security sets into motion a series of events that fractures their relationship and necessitates that Marion seek care from other sources. This decision also arguably leads at least partially to Mr. Forrester's illness, and thus the care that Marion gives him, which seems to drain her physically and emotionally. After she experiences this instance of failed care in her marriage, Marion begins to rely more on other sources of care beyond it. Of course, Marion had relationships with other men, particularly Frank Ellinger, earlier in the novel, but here she begins to depend on them for more. For instance, Ivy Peters gives Marion the financial stability that her husband cannot grant her by renting her land and buying her home. One could not quite call what Ivy Peters gives Marion care, as it is too transactional in nature and feels too much as though he is, quote, asserting his power over her, end quote. However, this transactional relationship would not be necessary if Captain Forrester had considered Marion's financial needs more before deciding to pay back the depositors. One of the more nefarious instances of caretaking in A Lost Lady occurs when the women of the town invade the Forrester home after Daniel's second stroke. The sickness itself seems to make the Forresters vulnerable to the type of invasion that Funda describes in her article. Before the second stroke, Marion Forrester was able to, quote, maintain her old reserve. She had asked nothing and accepted nothing. However, when her husband reaches the point of helplessness, she can, quote, hold off the curious no longer, as they invade her home under the pretense of caring for the ailing Captain Forrester. Here we see that care closes distance, even when the motives driving it are morally suspect, thereby facilitating the slippage from intimacy into invasion that Funda traces. The pretense of care allows Molly Tucker and Mrs. Beasley to go, quote, in and out of Mrs. Forrester's kitchen as familiarly as they pleased, and to make judgments about her in the process. Under the guise of care, the townswomen invade the Forrester home, gain false intimacy, and cast judgment from this privileged up-close view. Partially driven by the judgmental women that invade the Forrester home, Neil decides to give up a year of school in order to care for Daniel Forrester, and by extension, Marion. While ostensibly taking over the Forresters' care in order to save them from the prying, judgmental eyes of the townswomen, Neil possesses judgmental eyes of his own, as we have already seen by this point in the text. He, quote, firmly tells the women that they are very kind, but now nothing is needed, depriving them of care as an excuse to get close and judge. He brings quiet into the house and does not allow anyone else in. While Daniel seems to appreciate the quiet, the reader can't help but ask what drives this action on Neil's part. Does he really shoo away onlookers for Daniel's benefit, or is he motivated by his own need to protect the Forresters from the public gaze and preserve their image as it exists in his mind, as an idealized couple from the frontier days? Or is it both? When we examine what Neil actually does in his caretaking role in the Forrester household, it seems that keeping watch in his silent, quote, vigils and keeping others away constitute the sole tasks he actually performs for the Forresters at this time. He wants less to protect the Forresters from judgment and more to judge them, mostly Marion, with his own eyes, and to use his role as caregiver to position himself as the only person close enough to judge it all. He also uses his caretaking role to further ingratiate himself with the Forresters. He attempts to leverage the acts of care he performs for a place in this community he desperately wants to be a part of. He acknowledges that his decision to care for the Forresters, quote, had been hard and cost him something, which is no doubt true, but also shows that he's kind of leaning into the element of self-effacement and self-sacrifice that scholars of care often discuss as integral to the ethic of care. He seems attracted to this self-denial as a means of getting closer to the Forresters and distinguishing himself as one of, quote, those who keep faith, end quote. In her analysis of care ethics in the professor's house, Hyo-jung Byun claims that one of the main aims of care should be, quote, helping others grow, which she argues Augusta does for Godfrey St. Peter. However, it becomes clear as we get to know Neil better that his main interest lies in not in helping others to grow, but rather in keeping them the same and preserving the image of the mythologized frontier figures from the past. Notably, Neil ends his care for and any connection with Marion after witnessing a moment of physical intimacy between her and Ivy Peters. And after that, he does not honor any responsibilities he might once have felt toward her. As soon as he realizes he cannot control her actions or cannot control her actions, he relinquishes any responsibility to aid or care for her and leaves her, quote, without bidding her goodbye and with weary contempt for her in his heart. Afterward, Neil thinks, quote, he had given Marion a year of his life, and she had thrown it away. He had helped the captain die peacefully, he believed, and now it was the captain who seemed the reality. Here we can clearly see that Neil does not grant Marion kind of full humanity or quote, reality in the way he does the captain. She can either exactly fit an idealized image that he has of her or be considered unworthy of his care in his eyes. Because he cares more for his own image of Marion than for Marion herself, when disillusioned with the image, there's not much left with which he feels connected to or responsible for. The novel also ends with care, as Neil and Ed Elliott discuss Marion's care at the end of her life in the final paragraphs. Neil runs into Ed in the last chapter, and Ed tells the story of Marion's life after her first husband's death. She ends up marrying another man, moving to Buenos Aires, and dying far away from her previous life. Significantly, Ed mentions that Marion was, quote, well cared for at the end of her life, and Neil takes comfort in this idea. Ed also details the way in which the care community between Marion and Daniel Forrester continues even after death through the caretaking of grave sites. When she was alive, Marion sent flowers to decorate Daniel Forrester's grave annually, and then her new husband, Henry Collins, sends a letter, quote, with a draft for the future care of Captain Forrester's grave in memory of my late wife, Marion Forrester Collins, end quote. In this way, the circle of caretaking continues posthumously, as Marion's caregiving ties to Daniel are honored by her second husband. As we can see, complicated ethical questions surround caretaking and the communities it creates in A Lost Lady. What does the work of caretaking do? What motivates characters' care in the text, and what do these motivations reveal about the various characters and the community as a whole? What happens when care is used to pervert intimacy into an invasion through patriarchal surveillance, judgment, and control? By examining these and other questions, we can come closer to uncovering the ways that caregiving reveals both the bonds that unite and the social ills that tear down this community. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Phoenix, Keegan, and Sarah. At this time, I will ask our staff member to bring me some engaging, thoughtful questions to pose to our panelists. And I see several. All right, so our first question is for Phoenix. And the question is there any value in exploring the idea of, quote, the good death that prevailed in communications of World War I soldiers' deaths, comparing that to the death of the hogs or other examples of painful or gruesome animal death?
Hello? Excellent. I think that would definitely be a worthwhile pursuit. I have written a different paper on Claude's wounded masculinity and kind of how he, I guess in his eyes, salvages that with the good death that he experiences at the end of one of ours. Whereas, of course, it seems that the animals who lose their lives back on the farm don't have any greater cause that they are dying for, but to Claude, it does feel like they are dying for that greater cause. So, yeah, thank you for your question.
Thank you. Next, this one is addressed to Keegan. Is the idea of pain and pleasure, in your opinion, what situates some of Cather's work as, quote, nostalgic? Is nostalgia just another way of plumbing both Cather's pain and pleasure of remembering Nebraska?
How loudly can I say yes, I think? Yeah, Nebraska, everywhere really that she writes about is whoever asked that question is exactly right, is written with both the sense of like longing for innocence, typically characterized during childhood, right? And also this like, and also a certain suppressive energy too, that exists when one grows from that childhood into a more mature artistic adulthood. I mean, this tracks biographically. It's interesting that both of those things don't exist together during the same time, so I'll have to do some thinking about that, how that changes when one ages for her in her work. But I think it can completely be coded along the lines of nostalgia as much as it can, as much as it's present in her work literally.
Thank you. Okay, now this question is long, and the person who wrote it apologized, but I think we have plenty of time to pose it. And this is for Sarah. Thank you for such a wonderful talk. My question is, how would you characterize Marion's care for Neil? It's like a multiple choice. Do you think it's motherly, even though she's not a mother? Or is it out of a societal role of an upper class lady? Or C, is it to fill the amount of empty time she has with human connection? Or do you think it's something else?
That's a really good question. And I think something that I'm definitely aware of when I read like Marion's Care, especially in that the first scene where he breaks his arm, is that it's so from his own perspective that I think, I don't know how much of that maternalness that I might be picking up on might be because like that's something that he's looking for. So I would characterize it as maternal, but maybe for that reason, and maybe less because of Marion's actual like literal actions, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think so. So sort of like Neil is projecting his desires for mothering onto Marion.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I think so.
okay, thank you. All right, another question for Keegan, and this is regarding Captain Forrester. So Neil says he realizes that without Captain Forrester, the lonely home would not have been, or it wasn't at all. Mrs. Forrester, who made it wasn't all Mrs. Forrester who made this home gracious. So, hang on. So does this add to his steel, this idea that without Captain Forrester, there wouldn't have been a home?
Yeah, literally, right. We can talk about the him laying down the both proverbial stake and the literal stake in the land, right, to mark off the place as he's traveling and building the railroad. That's going to mark the location of the future home. And you can really move beyond just the household. You can make an argument that Sweetwater itself is made from Daniel Forrester in this text. This is one of the sort of points that I was trying to get at regarding, like, the workers who work for Captain Forrester are sort of treated in the same way as the very mountains are, right? That everything sort of comes under the cultural, or moves under the cultural umbrella of the railroad man, if that makes sense. And so the place is not the place without Captain Forrester, definitely.
Thank you. This next question, and are there any more questions that need to be collected? We still have time. Okay. This is for Phoenix. And this question is about Ivy Peters and the early scene of him stunning and blinding the bird, and sort of the hatred that might inspire from readers. And this person is asking, do you think Cather, was she intentionally trying to, evoke a reaction that strong? Or do you think, what do you think the kind of reader reception is according to Cather's intentions?
Of course, it's always hard to speak to an author's intentions, but I do kind of argue that Cather endorses the Captain Forrester brand of chivalry and masculinity, and I believe that she does this most explicitly through making Ivy mutilate an animal in the very first chapter of her novel. And just the way that Neil continues to romanticize Captain Forrester after that and try to kind of step into his footsteps, in contrast to his extreme hatred for Ivy that pervades throughout the novel. So yes, I do believe that this was supposed to evoke that reaction from us, and I believe that's often why Cather does include these scenes of animal mutilation in the first place. It's something that's like almost none of us could ever imagine seeing, let alone doing. So of course it's going to evoke that sympathy from us right off the bat.
All right, thank you. It's all right. I have one question. A Lost Lady is often associated with Cather's 1923 essay, Nebraska, the End of the First Cycle, where she sort of chronicles the first generation of homesteaders and sort of what's happening as they kind of fade away. And towards the end of that essay, she writes, "In Nebraska, as in so many other states, we must face the fact that the splendid story of the pioneers is finished, and that no new story worthy to take its place has yet begun." So I wonder if all three of you might speak on this very strong claim and talk about how you think Cather might be trying to create a new worthy story through the use of the motifs that you spoke about, whether it's caregiving, injury, sort of the very direct animal symbolism and the symbolism between labor and mechanization and bodies. You know, what is there a worthy story there that she's presenting us about pioneers?
Yes, and I think it kind of has to do a little bit with modernist perspective a little bit in this text, right? Neil being such a powerful narrator who dips inside and outside of all these perspectives at the specific moment in time makes it difficult for us to actually parse out who's siding with who in the story, right? And it makes it nearly impossible for us to think about who Cather's siding with, especially if we have this additional problem of Neil dipping in and out of the narrative. And so at this moment in time, Cather is telling an important story that generates such like diverse reader responses too, I think, and that's a part of what she's doing in this text, is pushing stylistically in that way, you know.
Yeah, and I think for Cather, maybe part of what's interesting in the post-Pioneer days is the absence of the grand adventure of the Pioneer days. So, like, what do boys like Neil do when they can't just go out on a pioneer adventure and settle a little plot of land in Nebraska? That a lot of complications seem to arise there for Cather. So she has seemed to find her own version of adventure, I think, in the post-Pioneer days, but I'm also really interested in how far back in time Cather goes, especially as she goes later into her career. So yeah, I think she will continually be looking back a little bit.
Yeah, I don't think I really have much to add to that. I think I was also kind of looking at it as, yeah, like Neil's perspective being a big part of this story, and almost like questioning the story as being a story as well. Like, I do feel like having Neil as the narrator who is idealizing those frontier days also kind of pushes back on the frontier narrative as well, which I haven't read that essay, but so it's interesting that she then says something so firm in that direction as well. So that's interesting.
Similarly, if I can add one more thing too, she also sort of moves to talk about what it's like to be a cosmopolitan artist who comes from a small town, right? How does that work in memory for the artist? How do that's such an important theme of her work. How does the past sort of collapse onto the present while you're writing, even? And so these are the starts. So she starts to turn inward in that way, I think, and start to think about that. How does the past place exist in the present mind, even with all the mechanization and everything that's happened?
Wonderful. All right. Well, if there are no more questions, that concludes our second session of the 68th Annual Willa Cather Spring Conference. Our next session will be our next session will start at 12:30 here in the Opera House Auditorium, and we will be streaming a discussion with Dr. Benjamin Taylor, who is set to publish a new Cather biography in November. And I will be on Zoom with Dr. Taylor, and you all will be in here watching us chat. So stay tuned for that. That's part of a 4-part discussion series that is happening virtually throughout the year. And then at 2 o'clock, we will have our third session, April Twilight's Cather as Poet, here in this auditorium as well. And so once again, one more thank you for our presenters this morning, Phoenix Fogarty, Keegan Hensley, and Sarah Wade. Thank you.